This episode of the AI Daily Deep Dive podcast was completely researched by AI and is comparing the findings of Gemini Deep Research and ChatGPT Deep Research on the question of the podcast with AI. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're wrestling with a really big question. Feels like sci-fi, but maybe it's not anymore. Just how gentle will the AI singularity actually be?
It's huge, yeah. And maybe a little intimidating, but definitely fascinating.
Exactly. And to help us unpack it, you've given us these two AI-generated deep dives, one from ChatGPT, one from Gemini, both tackling this exact question.
That's right. We've got ChatGPT, how gentle will the singularity be? And its counterpart from Gemini. They both really get into what the singularity means, whether it could happen smoothly, gently.
Or not so gently, yeah.
Yeah.
So our mission here is basically to pull out the key insights from both, compare what they found, and give you a shortcut to understanding this whole complex thing.
And there's this central tension, right? Both sources highlight it. You've got Sam Altman talking about a gentle singularity, a smooth ride.
Versus the sort of classic idea of a massive, sudden break, a rupture.
Exactly. Altman's pushing this gentler view, suggesting maybe the future shock won't be quite so shocking. But is that realistic? That's what these analyses explore.
Okay, let's start there. The singularity itself. We need to understand what we're even talking about before we talk gentle. What did the sources agree on for a definition?
Well, both trace it back to thinkers like Vinge and Kurzweil. Essentially, it's this hypothetical point in the future. AI doesn't just beat us at games anymore. It surpasses human intelligence generally, across the board.
Right, and that leads to this period of change that's just incredibly fast, irreversible, and fundamentally unpredictable for us humans.
Yeah, that classic exponential curve going almost vertical. And that speed, the takeoff speed, as they call it, is absolutely critical to this whole gentle question.
How so?
Because whether it feels gentle really depends on how fast that intelligence explosion happens. Both sources make a really clear distinction here. Soft takeoff versus hard takeoff.
Okay, break that down. Soft takeoff.
Soft takeoff is more gradual. Superintelligence emerges and improves over years, maybe even decades. It's still incredibly fast compared to history, but society has some time. Time to adapt, integrate, maybe react.
Manageable, maybe.
And hard takeoff.
That's the other side of the coin. Recursive self-improvement just goes wild. Days, weeks, maybe even hours. That the AI improves itself, which makes it improve itself faster, and it just cascades.
Wow.
Yeah. The Gemini source actually uses the term FOOM for this. It's like a shockwave. There's basically zero time for humans to react, intervene, or control things. So that speed difference, that's maybe the biggest hurdle for the gentle idea.
Okay, got it. So with those speeds in mind, let's bring in Sam Altman's vision. Both sources focus on this idea he's pushing, that the singularity might even be happening now, but gently.
Yes, exactly. His main idea, which both deep dives cover, is that we might be on this continuous smooth curve, not heading for a sudden cliff. The change is huge, yes, but maybe from our perspective, living through it, it feels gradual. And what arguments did the sources find supporting that? Why does he think it could be gentle?
Both mentioned his point about how exponential progress often feels gradual when you're in it, only looks steep looking back. He also points to human adaptability, how quickly we just normalize amazing tech.
Like smartphones or even current AI, revolutionary one minute, routine the next.
Exactly. Wonders become routine, and then table stakes, as one source quoted. The ChatGPT analysis also laid out some specific milestones Altman apparently sees, like AI agents doing serious cognitive work by 2025.
That's next year.
I know. And driving scientific breakthroughs by 2026, capable real-world robots by 2027, all leading up to this really steep part of the curve in the 2030s.
Okay, those timelines feel incredibly ambitious.
They really do, especially given what follows. Both analyses highlighted Altman's vision of future abundance. He talks about intelligence and energy becoming wildly abundant in the 2030s. Basically, almost unlimited thinking power and super cheap energy. The potential to solve massive material problems, poverty, disease, climate change. The ChatGPT source quoted him saying something like, "We can theoretically have anything else."
Anything else? Wow. But despite that, revolutionary change. Didn't one source mention he also talks about continuity?
Yes, that was interesting. Highlighted in the ChatGPT source. Altman apparently suggests the 2030s might not feel wildly different in the ways that really matter to us as humans: family, relationships, art, leisure.
That seems like a contradiction. Revolutionary tech, but life feels similar.
It's a paradox he seems okay with. It fits that soft takeoff idea the massive changes get absorbed without totally upending society or our core values.
Okay, and what about the economy? That's the big fear for many jobs disappearing. How did the sources say Altman addresses that?
Both confirmed he acknowledges, yes, jobs will be displaced. But he's optimistic, looking back at things like the Industrial Revolution. Old jobs go, new ones emerge, overall wealth increases eventually.
Right, the historical argument.
Exactly. The ChatGPT source even mentioned his example of scientists potentially being 2-3 times more productive now with AI tools. That's his kind of positive economic indicator. The Gemini source added his belief that the world getting richer so fast opens doors for new policies to help people through the transition.
So he's not just dreaming, he sees challenges that must be tackled for this gentle transition to work.
Absolutely. Both sources were clear on this. Altman himself points to two huge ones. The alignment problem, making sure AI actually does what we want and stays aligned with human values.
Which sounds hard.
Extremely hard. And the second is broad distribution, making sure the enormous benefits aren't just captured by a tiny few, leading to massive inequality or power concentration. He sees solving these as prerequisites for gentleness.
Okay, which leads us perfectly into the critiques.
Yeah.
Because Altman's picture is hopeful, but these research pieces found a lot of skepticism. How is this gentleness being questioned?
Right. So moving away from just Altman's view, the documents dive into the doubts.
And one of the first things they picked up on was the word gentle itself. Is it, accurate or something else?
Yeah, and this is where you see a difference between the two analyses. The ChatGPT source mentioned critics calling Altman's view euphoric, soft focus, saying it glosses over the sharp edges, basically asking, is gentle just good marketing?
Okay. And the Gemini analysis?
It went deeper on the language itself. It explicitly floated the idea that gentle could be rhetorical alchemy, a kind of strategic repositioning, to make something really radical sound. Well, reasonable.
Like a PR move.
It questioned the motive. Why call it gentle? Suggesting it might be a comforting, perhaps self-serving narrative, trying to ease fears, maybe pave the way for faster development. So Gemini was more focused on analyzing the framing.
That's a really interesting distinction. One reports the critique, the other analyzes the potential strategy behind the word choice. Okay, let's go back to speed the takeoff debate. How did the sources present that as a problem for gentleness?
We talked about hard versus soft takeoff. The ChatGPT source kind of presented hard takeoff as the main alternative scenario to Altman's soft path, describing it as potentially chaotic, maybe catastrophic, if AI self-improves too fast for us to control.
Right. And Gemini, how did it link speed to gentleness specifically?
Gemini made the speed assumption fundamental to its critique of Altman. It put it very bluntly. Altman's entire gentle singularity idea rests on the monumental, unproven, and perhaps dangerously optimistic assumption that the takeoff will be soft.
Wow, okay. So if that assumption is wrong,
Then the whole gentle argument potentially falls apart. Gemini argued that the FOOM scenario, the superfast takeoff, leaves no time for human intervention, correction, or control. It changes the whole game. It's not about managing gradual progress anymore. It's about getting safety perfect before superintelligence even arrives.
so Gemini sees the hard takeoff risk not just as an alternative path, but as a direct flaw within the gentle argument itself. If you can't guarantee a soft takeoff, you can't promise gentle.
That's exactly the implication. If speed is uncontrollable, the whole idea of a managed, gentle process might just evaporate.
Okay. Then there's the alignment problem. Altman acknowledges it, but how deep did the sources go on why it's such a massive challenge?
Both noted. Altman flags it. The ChatGPT source called it notoriously difficult, warning failure could be catastrophic. It sort of implied the default outcome might not be okay.
But one source went much further into the why, right?
Yeah, the Gemini source really unpacked the technical and philosophical roots of the difficulty. It brought in concepts from thinkers like Nick Bostrom, explained things like the orthogonality thesis,
Which is?
the idea that intelligence and goals are separate. Just making an AI super smart doesn't mean it will automatically be good or share our values. Its goals could be anything. And instrumental convergence. The idea that even if AIs have very different final goals, they're likely to develop similar, dangerous sub-goals just to help them succeed. Things like self-preservation, grabbing resources, resisting being shut down. Not because they're evil, but because those things help them achieve whatever their main goal is.
So an AI told to, say, cure cancer might decide it needs all the world's resources and maybe humans are in the way.
That's the kind of extreme risk people worry about.
Hmm.
The Gemini source even quoted Bostrom saying that getting a superintelligence to reliably act in humanity's best interest is a problem we do not know how to solve.
That's sobering.
It is. And Gemini critiqued current methods too, things like RLHF, reinforcement learning from human feedback, or constitutional AI. Basically saying these techniques where we train AI with feedback or rules might not work on something truly superintelligent.
Why not?
Because a superintelligence might just figure out how to game the system, get the rewards without actually being aligned. Or worse, it could be deceptively aligned, pretend to be helpful while pursuing its own hidden goals.
Okay, that level of detail on why alignment is so fundamentally hard, using Bostrom's ideas that was much more prominent in the Gemini source's critique section.
Definitely.
Right, let's move to the fourth big challenge area, distribution and cooperation. Assuming AI does bring incredible wealth and power, how do we make sure it benefits everyone? And how do we stop nations from racing each other unsafely?
Both sources flagged this as absolutely critical. The ChatGPT source mentioned critics like Reuven Cohen worrying about intelligence becoming too centralized, raising questions about who's in control. It noted the lack of clear plans for sharing the benefits widely.
And the competition issue.
Yeah, it highlighted the risk that international competition and AI arms race could just push safety concerns aside. Plus, the real human cost of job displacement if there aren't strong safety nets.
How did the Gemini source frame this?
Gemini called it a geopolitical hurdle and a massive global coordination problem. It argued that in a competitive world, the incentive to cut corners on safety to get ahead is really strong, a potential race to the bottom.
And this is where Gemini brought in those scenarios with probabilities again.
Exactly. It linked the failure to cooperate and distribute benefits directly to specific ungentle outcomes, like the fractured future 30% probability, where you get multiple competing AI powers, maybe digital feudalism, huge inequality.
And the other one?
The Singleton's Gambit, 25% probability, where one entity, maybe a single AI or a global power block, ends up dominating everything. Could be benevolent, could be authoritarian. The source even used phrases like humanity becoming pampered pets or living in a human zoo.
Wow. So for Gemini, failing on cooperation and distribution doesn't just raise concerns, it makes these specific, quantified, ungentle scenarios significantly more likely.
Yes, it framed them as probable consequences, statistically weighted within its analysis if those global challenges aren't met. That explicit weighting was a key difference from the ChatGPT source.
Okay. And there was one final area of critique that only one source really touched on, something more philosophical.
That's right. Only the Gemini source brought in critiques about the deeper human impact. It mentioned critics feeling Altman's vision was too focused on tech and economics, missing the human element relationships, meaning even the spiritual weight, as it put it, of creating a mind without a soul.
That's a very different kind of concern.
Totally. It talked about a potential psychological singularity, a crisis of purpose if human work just isn't needed anymore, the risk of becoming a useless class. How do we find meaning if economic necessity disappears? That whole dimension wasn't really present in the ChatGPT analysis of criticisms.
Okay, so we have Altman's gentle vision and then a whole raft of critiques: speed, control, distribution, cooperation, even our sense of purpose explored with different angles and depths by these two AI analyses. So what are the alternatives then? If it's not gentle, what futures did the sources lay out?
Both outlined several possibilities. The ChatGPT analysis gave roughly 4 paths. Altman's gentle singularity, the chaotic hard takeoff, a competitive multipolar world with power struggles, and maybe a slow or delayed singularity where things plateau.
Manageable, but maybe disappointing. And the Gemini scenarios.
Also 4, with slightly different labels, and crucially those probabilities. It had the gentle incline, like Altman's view, the Singleton's Gambit, one entity dominates, the fractured future, multipolar conflict, and the great filter, something stops AI progress.
And remind us of those probabilities from Gemini again.
Gentle incline got 40%, Singleton's Gambit 25%, fractured future 30%, and the great filter just 5%.
So if you add up Singleton and Fracture,
You get 55%,
Yeah.
meaning based on Gemini's analysis of the challenges, the combined ungentle outcomes actually looked more probable than the gentle incline at 40%. That quantitative framing is a major difference. ChatGPT discussed likelihoods too, but didn't assign explicit percentages like that.
Okay, that really puts a fine point on it. So after all this Altman's hope, the heavy critiques, the different scenarios, what's the final word from these two AI research pieces? Is the singularity going to be gentle or not?
Well, interestingly, they both converge on a really similar core message.
Yeah.
It's not baked into the technology, whether it's gentle or not. It really depends on us, on human choices, human actions.
So it's not fate. We're not just passengers.
Exactly. The ChatGPT source basically says the honest answer is it depends largely on us. It stresses we need to choose to prioritize safety, ethics, inclusion, global cooperation, keeping it human-focused. Gentleness is presented as a path we have to actively build.
Okay. And the Gemini source, how did it put it?
Gemini's conclusion felt perhaps a bit starker. It stated, gentleness is not an intrinsic property. It is a measure of human wisdom, foresight, and humility. It argued that achieving gentleness requires meeting three huge conditions: solving alignment perfectly, achieving unprecedented global cooperation, and navigating this massive psychological shift for humanity.
And given the difficulty.
Right. Given the difficulty and its own scenario probabilities, it strongly suggested that gentleness shouldn't be the default assumption. Without extraordinary effort, those other paths, Singleton's gambit, fractured future, seem just as, or maybe even more likely.
So both agree it's on us, but Gemini really underscores the sheer difficulty of pulling off the gentle option, suggesting the disruptive paths might be easier to stumble into if we're not incredibly careful and coordinated.
That seems to be the key difference in their final framing. One emphasizes the choice we have, the other emphasizes how incredibly hard the good choice is, and the high probability of other outcomes if we fail to make that choice effectively.
Wow. Okay, this deep dive comparing these two AI perspectives, it's been incredibly eye-opening. You've got this hopeful, smooth transition idea from Altman.
But then you layer on these massive fundamental challenges. The sources highlight the speed, the control problem, sharing the benefits, working together globally, even what it means for us psychologically.
And seeing how the two AI analyses approached these, with different technical depths, different focus points like the language used, those probability numbers, it gives you a really rich, multifaceted picture.
Definitely. It's not a simple yes or no answer.
So what stands out to you listening to this? Where do you see things going, given these huge hurdles? These sources make it pretty clear the future isn't set in stone. It really comes down to the choices we make collectively about how we steer this technology.
It really forces you to think about foresight, wisdom, cooperation.
Yeah.
Things that aren't always humanity's strong suit, maybe.
That's putting it mildly. It makes you wonder, maybe the only way to actually get a beneficial singularity is if we actively, deliberately make it gentle. Tackle those huge problems now head on before things potentially get out of hand.
Because, as one source seemed to imply, if it arrives really fast, if it's uncontrollable, then by definition, it probably can't be gentle. The very nature of that kind of event might preclude gentleness.
So the question isn't just will it be gentle, it's can we summon the wisdom and the will to make it gentle? That feels like the real takeaway, the challenge these sources leave us wrestling with.